So, can President Trump actually sue the BBC? You probably know what I'm talking about. It's been in the news, and Dan's done a really good video about this, where he's gone through all the their equivalent of a letter before action. It's like a notice letter that has to be sent. But what I thought I'd do is just, because there's a very interesting point about jurisdiction. Because could Trump sue in England? No, he couldn't. Limitation for defamation in England and Wales is 1 year. And the broadcast was more than a year ago. And we have we've got rid of what we used to call the repetition rule, which was every time that the offending statement was republished, it set the clock again. That's now gone. You have to sue from the first date of the publication. There are ways around limitation. It wouldn't apply in this case, but I've discussed it a lot with all the looted Holocaust art cases, where what if you only find out about something after limitation? And that can happen in defamation. Say, for example, you found out more than 12 months later that the reason you'd lost out on a job was because of a defamatory letter sent to somebody, you know, like a reference or something like that. Then the rule is, if you weren't on notice, and there was no way that even with reasonable due diligence you could have been aware of the statement, that can be a reason for disapplying the limitation period. But that wouldn't apply here, obviously, because it's, you know, it was a broadcast. So Trump has said he's going to sue in Florida. But the issue there is, was the offending statement published in Florida? Because with the Panorama broadcast, you could either watch it in the UK, on sort of like, you know, ordinary television, or you could watch it on iPlayer. But iPlayer is region locked because of the TV license. So there was no legal way of viewing this Panorama program in the United States. However, people obviously, and I was discussing this with some of my US lawyer friends, and I'd like to give a big shout out to Jay Rabin, who's been really helpful on this and dug me all sorts of really fascinating cases out. And also Viva Frey, who pointed out that he is a lawyer and he once stopped in a Holiday Inn in Florida. So he felt qualified. You know, in all fairness, he's more qualified than me to discuss these things. So yeah, shout out guys, that's been really helpful. But the issue that's going to be very interesting is, can they show that the BBC actually published in Florida? Because the only way of watching it was to do it illicitly, you know, use a VPN or some other hacking thing, or if somebody had actually reproduced it, you know, in breach of copyright on another channel. And we were sort of discussing, it's like, what if, you know, a book wasn't on sale in a particular jurisdiction, but somebody imported thousands of copies of the books and just sold them in their bookshop? Would that count as publication in the jurisdiction? So what will happen? Well, there is a procedure under a case, it's called the Venetian salami case, which I think is really good. And that allows for a sort of, you can do a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the offending tort didn't occur within the jurisdiction. But that, of course, is a matter of law to determine that. And you can actually get limited disclosure before everything kicks off, just to see, you know, just for the purposes of that motion. Because I think the thing here with Trump is, it's whether or not, you know, not so much that he's bothered about winning, but of course if he brings this, if he can get this to trial, then obviously there's all the publicity about what the BBC got up to. But there's also, it would trigger disclosure, because I think it'd be perfectly entitled to say, right, I want to see all the internal documents about who made this decision, did anybody challenge it, you know, what thought was put into it. Because we've already seen that, you know, there are rumours that certain senior people weren't very happy with the edit. Because that's the other thing. I mean, this is before we get on to, is it defamatory, can he show a loss and all that sort of thing. And I'll come on to briefly about what Florida law is, because luckily it's very, very similar to English and Welsh law. But that would be the first thing. So the first thing, if this goes ahead, the BBC could do a challenge to jurisdiction. And it's what we sometimes call it forum non-conveniens. In other words, this isn't the right place to sue. You should sue where the tort actually occurred, where the publication occurred, which is the UK, sorry, England and Wales, and that's why he's barred. But under Florida law, it has a long arm sort of provision. In other words, you can sue somebody in Florida if you suffered harm in Florida, even if the tort was committed outside the jurisdiction. I mean, this is quite a common thing in trying to argue about where forums are. You know, where the correct forum is. I mean, at bar school, we were given the example. They said, consider an English guy on holiday on the French side of the Alps, throws a snowball, which injures a German guy on holiday on the Italian side of the Alps. If the German guy wants to sue, where can he sue? And the argument is he could probably sue anywhere. If all things are equally balanced, then the first court, quotes, seized of the jurisdiction. In other words, the first place that somebody actually initiated the claim, they get to keep it. But you can challenge that and say, well, actually, there's the more appropriate forum for this to be heard, because either that's where the tort was committed, or that's when the harm occurred, or that's where the defendant lives, or that's where the claimant lives. You can argue and say it should actually be in a different jurisdiction. So that's the first hurdle President Trump has to get over, is whether or not the Florida court actually has jurisdiction to hear this claim, because arguably the argument will be, we did not publish in the jurisdiction. So if you want to chase after anybody, you have to chase after the people who made it possible to view this in the other jurisdiction. But what about the law generally? It's very, very similar. Again, the Florida courts have the repetition rule. In other words, you've got to sue from the first date of the publication. But in Florida, limitation for defamation is 2 years. So if he can get over the hurdle of who actually published, then yes, he is within time. Also, similarly to how in 2013 we got rid of the idea that defamation was actionable per se. In other words, you didn't actually have to show, well, libel, which television programs count as because they're permanent. You had to show, you didn't have to show actual damage. It was just seen as, it was defamatory per se, and the courts could assume that damage had occurred. We got rid of that in 2013, and now you have to show serious harm. They have a very similar thing in Florida. They've got rid of the idea that libel is it's defamatory per se. Again, he would have to show some damage. So he'd have to show, first of all, that the statement was defamatory. And he'd also have to show that that was a reason that he suffered damage. Bearing in mind, lots of other people were making similar allegations, about what happened and whether he was responsible for what happened on January the 6th. So I think that might be a very hard one to overcome. But of course, in Florida, it's a jury. So it would be a jury trial. And it'd be interesting because, the demographics of Florida do tend to lean, it's rather confusing that they call it red over there, which I always get mixed up, because over here, of course, keep the red flag flying here. Red is left, blue is right. But apparently this all just dates back to, I think it was just some news programme that they just started using red and blue, on an election night thing to show how people were doing, and it just caught on, and that's why the Republicans are now the red people and the Democrats are now the blue people. But yeah, it's probably a red state leaning jury. So it'd be very interesting. But yeah, like I say, first of all, he's got to show, is it a defamatory statement? There's also the defence over there of effectively the same we have here, that it's substantially true. So you could say, well, that edit didn't actually, really change anything. Even if we'd have shown this full video, the implication would have been the same. I actually think they might be in trouble there, because it's not so much that they edited things together. Although I think if they'd done a crossfade or a few moments later type thing, they might have been better. But they actually cut out the bit that sort of said, go down there peacefully. And I think that is something that is quite major. And I think that might, if this were to go to trial, then that would actually be a problem for the BBC, because yes, you can say, well, we just compress things and we're not expected to show an entire full 1 hour speech. We just showed the key points. But it's what they left out, I think, more than, the actual tightness of the edit, which implies that, it creates a phrase that seems to be very much a call to arms. So it probably is a misrepresentation. I think they could still make the argument that even if we'd shown the whole thing, it would still, still amount to incitement, and that, our opinion, it's an incitement. But I think that is a tricky one for them. But there you go. Yeah. So my prediction, if this goes anywhere, is the BBC will do a motion to dismiss because lack of jurisdiction. There will be a pre-trial hearing to hear the motion. But prior to that, Trump would be entitled to limited, they call it discovery over there, limited discovery to actually argue the jurisdiction point. So, how did this get into the public? He would have to sort of say there's a publication in the jurisdiction. Now we've got the internet, this happens quite a lot, because you used to get a lot of forum shopping, because prior to 2013, England and Wales was considered to be a very claimant, or back then, claimant-friendly jurisdiction, nearly said plaintiff. Post-2013 and post-LaShow, that's the case that said it has to show serious harm. And you have to actually evidence the serious harm, you can't just assume it. I think it does become you know, a lot more difficult to sue here. So I can see why he wants to sue sue in Florida. But it does happen here where people say, well, yes, the newspaper is published in sort of like, you know, the Emirates or something. However, you could access it on their website, and that was a case called Jamil about that, where the allegations were very serious because they were, you know, the allegations of funding Al Qaeda. But in the court, they said, well, look, only 4 people in the UK actually saw this website. You know, they got the metadata, and 2 of those were you and your lawyer. So, yes, it was a serious allegation. Yes, technically it was published to people in the jurisdiction, but it was published to so few people. It's just, as I said, that it's not just that the game is not worth a candle, it's not even worth the wick. I mean, they said, you know, in the old days, the courts just provided a pitch and a referee, and the parties could play whatever game they wanted, but that's all changed now, so there's a lot more interventionist judicial case management. And I think we'll get something similar in Florida. I mean, Florida judges are fairly robust people. I know a few. They're, you know, very interesting, very, very nice people, but they are not to be dictated to. So, I mean, you get that really weird thing about whether they're appointees, you know, of one particular party or another. But in my experience, judges, you know, are very judicial. I mean, we'll have to have a chat sometime about the, you know, the role of SCOTUS and the politics of the Supreme Court in the US. But even there, I do think, obviously, they do tend to go an ideological bend, but that's more how they interpret the law. Rather than anything else. And like I say, judges in the US don't like being interfered with, so they certainly won't be allowed themselves to be bullied. So there you go. So yes, can Trump sue? Yes, he can sue. Can he sue in Florida? Well, that's what we'll find out. He certainly can issue the claim in Florida, and then, like I say, there'll probably be this motion to just strike out the claim, a motion to dismiss, as they call it over there, on the ground the court doesn't have jurisdiction. So there you go. As always, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely useful, vaguely informative. Again, sorry for the lack of, the dearth of videos. I've just been so busy. Thank you everybody for the nice comments about the MBR Beagles cases and signing the petition and everything. I know a lot of you have actually looked into this and, you know, been really willing to assist. But anyway, where I'm at, well, I was going to try and film outside for you, but it's raining. So I just came up to a little spot on the coast, so I'll just spin round. This is Perranporth. Oh, hang on. Let's turn the window down. It's a very nice spot. This is where St Piran supposedly arrived and brought Christianity to Cornwall. The legend is he floated in on a millstone. And that's quite a common thing down here for saints coming over from Ireland. I think there's probably some interesting truth in that, because they actually used to use millstones to balance coracles, and coracles were the main way of sort of travelling back then. And some people actually a few years ago, we were down in Falmouth, there were some guys in, I think we were in the chain locker, and they were going to take a coracle over to Ireland just to prove it could be done. And they were just getting like hammered in the pub waiting for the tide to be right. And we're going, are you guys even going to make it there? I said, no, it's all right, because we've got a support boat that's going to follow us and make sure we're safe. And we were like pointing to the other table where they were equally getting hammered. It's like, is that your support boat? Okay, well, I hope you've rung the RNLI. I mean, we did sort of cheer them off, and it took them about half an hour just to sort of get out of the harbour. But there you go. I mean, it's a nice spot. There's just on the horizon over there, you can't really see it, there's a lost oratory, supposedly 6th century, which they actually did excavate, but they've reburied it now. And there's also the famous lost church of St Piran. Although, as I point out, there's a sign to it and it's still there, so I don't see how it's lost. You can actually walk around the foundations. But it just got encroached with sand. But what they did is actually they just dismantled the church and rebuilt it at a place called Piranzabulo. And it's interesting because Piranzabulo actually means Piran in the sands, even though they moved it to be out of the sands. That's the Cornish for you.